The same candles burn, though not the same wax. The same dust motes drift, though not the same dust. Somewhere above us, Waterdeep still argues with itself in a dozen accents, and the sea wind still carries salt into the cracks of the city's stone. Down here, beneath cellar and sewer and forgotten stairwell, we have only lamplight, shelves, and the comfortable weight of old truth. You have returned to the secret stacks. Welcome again to the Lich's Tale, a Faerûn Lorecast. I am Aurelian Cantonine, Baelnorn, keeper of memory and stubborn enemy of oblivion. I do not hunger for kingdoms. I hunger for continuity. I took on this undying form so that history would not die simply because kings do. Last lesson, my eager apprentice, we stood on a high balcony and looked out across the whole continent, centuries stacked like books, empires rising and falling like tides. We traced the broad history of Faerûn from the era of the creator races through the calamities that modern folk still shiver to name. The fall of Netheril, the time of troubles, the spell plague, and the second sundering that steadied the world for the current age of 5th edition tales. Tonight, we do something that feels backward, and yet is the work of every true scholar. We turn the page the other way. We go back beyond empires, beyond calendars, beyond even the oldest dates that sages argue over in Candlekeep's margins. We go back to the age of myth, the age when the realms were not a map but a question, when the gods were not distant patrons but raw forces shaping reality, and when the first stories were not written on parchment but on the skin of the world itself. Before we begin, a brief word from today's generous sponsor. This episode is brought to you by Dharma Web Solutions, masters of crafting robust web applications and solving the thorny challenges of the modern internet. Whether you need an elegant front end, a scalable back end, or a seamless integration of the two, visit dharmawebsolutions.com. They weave code with the same care that I weave stories. Now, settle in again. The chairs remember you. The brazier has been fed. I have drawn out the oldest folios I dare place near an open flame, and I have locked certain doors because some truths do not like to be overheard. A scholar's warning for the second lesson. If the history of Faerûn is a tapestry, then the age of myth is the part woven with thread so fine that your fingers cannot feel it. We are speaking of an era before Del Reckoning, before the elves raised the standing stone, before dwarves carved their first runes into mountains, before dragons learned to hoard gold instead of storms. In such an age, our sources are not tidy chronicles. They are elven song cycles that treat truth as something you taste rather than measure. Dwarven creation hymns hammered into iron plates, solid, stubborn, and sometimes wrong, because stubbornness is not the same as accuracy. Draconic myths that begin with "I was there," even when the dragon telling the story was hatched 10,000 years too late. Temple liturgies, where theology and history are braided together so tightly you cannot cut one without bleeding the other. And in rare cases, relics, objects that remember. A blade with a divine name etched into it. A stone that still hums with old weave. A prison that dreams. So I repeat my promise from our first lesson. When a tale is uncertain, when accounts clash, When gods contradict, when the surviving records are half-burned, I will say so. I am not here to sell you a single perfect myth. I am here to hand you the lantern and show you where the footprints overlap. If you are ready, then let us begin at the beginning. And by the beginning, I mean the nearest approach to it that a mind like yours can survive. The uncounted beginning. There are many ways to describe the multiverse. Wizards prefer diagrams, priests prefer metaphors, sailors prefer that which is above us and occasionally falls on our heads. Yet nearly every tradition in Faerûn agrees on one uncomfortable fact. Before there were years, there were powers. Some call them gods, some call them primordials, some call them the first thoughts, and insist that reality began as a dream that decided to become solid. And then, always, like a shadow behind the curtain, there is Ao. Ao, the over-god. Ao is not worshipped the way other deities are worshipped. Not because he is weak, no, but because he does not bargain and he does not bless in the way mortals like. Ao is the law of the stage, not an actor in the play. In some traditions, Ao created all that exists, the crystal sphere that holds our world, the stars beyond it, even the gods themselves. In other accounts, he created the shell, the bounds of realm space, and within that space, the first beings stirred on their own, like sparks in a forge. Ao himself, when he has deigned to speak through prophets, has made statements that soothe no one. Some claim he once said he is the creator of the gods, but not of the realms themselves, words that raise more questions than they answer. If he created the gods, who or what created him? If he did not create the realms, then what did? And why does his hand still close around the world when he chooses? Ah, apprentice, if you want a simple creator, worship Chontea. If you want an understandable tyrant, worship Bane. Ao is neither. He is a boundary, which is why he is so often present in the oldest myths. Boundaries are what separate before from after, the two sisters in the void. Among the most widely told creation stories of realm space, taught in temples, whispered in wizard circles, and argued over by sages who should be sleeping, there is a tale of twin goddesses born from the earliest stuff of existence. Shar, Selûne, darkness, light, loss, change. In this telling, after Ao established the sphere of our universe, after the first mist of raw creation drifted through the emptiness, two powers coalesced. One embraced shadow so perfectly that even the idea of color seemed offensive. The other shone with a cool radiance like moonlight on fresh snow. They were sisters. They were rivals. They were, for a time, partners. Together, Shar and Selûne shaped the heavens of realm space. They gathered matter out of the cosmic ether and began to form worlds, great spheres turning in the dark. One of those spheres would become central to our tale, Abea Toril. And as the world formed, it gained something more than rock and water. It gained a spirit, Chontea, the world's heart. In many traditions, Chontea, the Earth Mother, was born as Abea Toril took shape, not created as a tool, but awakened as a consciousness, the living will of soil, seed, root, and stone. She's often described as one of the eldest deities of Faerûn, not because she is older than Shar and Selûne, but because she was present at the moment, the world became more than matter. Chauntea desired life, not merely existence, life, growth, multiplication, the green insistence of spring. And here the myth becomes a quarrel, because while Selûne's radiance could illuminate worlds and Shah's darkness could cradle them in cool quiet, neither warmth nor fire existed in this new cosmos. There was light, yes. There was shadow, yes, but no heat to coax life from stone. The world was beautiful, cold, and barren. Chauntea pleaded for warmth. Selûne listened. Shah refused. It is easy, apprentice, to frame this as good against evil, but the truth is subtler and more terrible. Shah is not merely a villain with a knife. Shah is the comfort of forgetting, the stillness of an ending, the seductive peace of nothingness. To Shah, a world without hunger, without pain, without struggle, because it has no life at all, can seem like perfection. Selûne, in contrast, is not merely kindness. Selûne is change. Change is hunger. Change is pain. Change is the endless turning of the wheel that breaks bodies and births new ones. Shah wanted a quiet universe. Selûne wanted a living one. And so the first great schism began. Selûne's gift and Shah's wound. In the oldest versions of the tale, Selûne reached beyond the cold darkness and seized the first fire, dragging warmth into realm space. Some myths say she stole it from an elemental realm of flame. Others insist she tore it from her own essence, bleeding light until the stars themselves were born as shards of her radiance. However it happened, Selûne brought warmth to Chauntea and Aber-Toril. Shah struck back. The two sisters battled, their conflict twisting the earliest cosmos. Some tales claim that in their struggle, Selûne cast pieces of herself into the void, tears, sparks, fragments, which became new lights in the heavens. Even today, Toril is orbited by a cluster of asteroids known as Selûne's Tears, and while sailors may curse them as hazards and astronomers may chart them as rock, priests still call them proof that the oldest myths left scars you can see. The battle did not end quickly. It did not end cleanly. And it did not end without consequence. Because when Selûne hurled her power against Shah, when light and darkness tore at each other hard enough to make the very concept of before and after meaningful, something new was born from the collision. Mistral, the first weave. The first goddess of magic is most often named Mistral. She is described in ancient texts as the child of light and shadow, born when Selûne's essence mingled with Shah's in violence. Where Selûne is moonlight and Shah is night, Mistral is the shimmer between, the prismatic possibility of reality becoming something else. Mistral mattered for one reason above all others. She made magic safe, or at least safer. Before Mistral, magic was simply raw power, the unshaped stuff of creation. To touch it was to touch fire without a skin. Yet as life began to stir and minds began to form, the ability to shape reality became inevitable. A universe with thinking beings is a universe that will attempt spells, whether gods approve or not. So Mistral did what only a newborn goddess, still flexible with possibility, could do. She took the raw force of magic and wove it into a structure, the weave. Think of it as a net cast over a storm, the storm remains. The net does not remove danger, but it gives shape. It gives pathways. It gives rules. It allows mortals later, much later, to draw power without being instantly obliterated. This, apprentice, is why the Age of Myth is not merely a bedtime story. It is a technical origin. The weave is not a metaphor. It is infrastructure. And like all infrastructure, it can fail. You have already heard in our first lesson how Mistral sacrificed herself during Karsus's folly so the weave would not unravel completely. That is the echo of a decision made at creation, to bind chaos into something usable. But we are not yet at Netheril, not even close. We are still at the first breath of reality, and at this point, the Pantheon is only beginning to fill. The first families of the gods. Once warmth existed, life had a chance. Once life had a chance, concepts began to matter. Birth, death, hunger, fear, joy, murder, mercy, time. In some faiths, the earliest gods beyond the two sisters and Chanter are said to have been born directly from the turbulence of creation, divine sparks popping into being like embers from a forge. In others, Selûne and Shar made lesser deities as tools or servants, only for those deities to grow into independent powers. Priests will argue this until the end of time, which is convenient, because the end of time is a topic priests adore. For our purposes, remember this: the gods of Faerûn are not a single family. They are a messy collection of lineages, stolen portfolios, mergers, rebirths, and rival pantheons imported by mortals from other lands and even other worlds. Yet in the Age of Myth, the Faerûnian pantheon begins to take recognizable shape. Selûne gathers allies of light, life, and change. Shar gathers allies of shadow, secrets, and loss. Chanter nurtures what grows between them. Mistral binds it all with the rules of magic. And somewhere above, Au watches, silent. If you find this dizzying, good. Dizziness means you are looking at something large. In our next section, we will speak of the weave as a living thing, because it is, and of how the first spellcasters, mortal or otherwise, learned to touch it without being consumed. But before we do, let me offer you a small comfort. You are not expected to memorize every divine genealogy. Even the gods forget who they were sometimes. They simply call it reinvention, the first great spell. If you take nothing else from tonight's lesson, take this. The weave is older than nations, older than languages, older than the word wizard. It is the first enduring enchantment ever laid upon Aber-Toril. Modern mages often speak of magic as if it were a ladder. You learn this cantrip, then this spell, then this ritual, and someday you climb high enough to look down on storms and smile. That is a comforting illusion. Magic is an ocean. The weave is the pattern of currents that makes the ocean navigable. Without the weave, the sea is still there, raw magic, primal and unbound. But a mortal ship that enters it is likely to snap apart. With the weave, there are channels, there are rules, there are moments when the current will carry you instead of drown you. In the Age of Myth, Mistral did not create magic. She created reliability. What the weave is and what it is not. To a priest, the weave is sometimes described as a gift, Mistral's mercy, later Mistra's law, the goddess placing her hand between mortals and annihilation. To a wizard, it is described as a lattice, a structure of invisible strands that link all things, so that when you pluck one strand, when you shape a syllable, trace a sigil, offer a pinch of bat guano, you tug on reality itself. Both are true in their own way. But do not imagine the weave as a simple net spread over the world like a fisherman's cast. The weave is not uniform. There are places where it is thick, like rope, where magic is strong, stable, and eager to be shaped. There are places where it is thin, frayed, or tangled, where spells misbehave, where wild surges twist intent into disaster, where even the most careful arcanist feels as if they are speaking a language the world has forgotten. In later ages, mortals learned to name such places: dead magic zones, wild magic zones, mythal-bound regions, and stranger things besides. In the age of myth, those names did not yet exist, but the texture existed, and it mattered because life was beginning. The first spellcasters were not human. When we imagine the first spellcaster, we imagine a mortal with hands and ambition. The truth is older and stranger. Before the first human ever whispered a cantrip, there were spirits that lived half in the world and half in the echoes of it. There were fae, bright and dangerous, who treated reality like a story you can edit with the right rhyme. There were elemental beings, embodiments of flame, water, stone, storm, who did not cast magic so much as breathe it, because they were made of it. And there were gods, of course, who did not cast spells. They defined what spells could be. In that sense, the earliest magic was not a practiced art. It was a natural phenomenon. A river running, a volcano breathing, a moon pulling tides. The weave turned those phenomena into something that could be touched and shaped intentionally. When mortals arrived, when their hands learned to make signs and their tongues learned to name power, they inherited a universe already humming with pathways. The divine and the arcane, a distinction that came later. In the modern realms, we often separate magic into categories: divine miracles, arcane spells, primal rites, psionic will. In the age of myth, that taxonomy is mostly a mortal convenience. A cleric's spell is a request granted by a god, yes, but the effect still ripples through the weave. A druid's working is shaped by nature's spirits and the living will of the land, yes, but the power still follows patterns. A wizard's incantation is a studied manipulation, yes, but it works only because the weave provides a stable set of rules to manipulate. Mortals argue about this because mortals love categories. The cosmos is less polite. Power is power. The weave is the road most of it travels, until someone builds a new road or burns the old one. Keep that thought. We will speak later of the shadow weave and of why Shah never forgot the first wound she took when Mistral was born. Selûne's face in the sky. You may have heard sailors call the moon Selûne as casually as they call the sea Umbali's mood. That habit is not mere poetry. In Faerûn, the moon and the goddess share a name because the boundary between symbol and reality is thin. Some priests claim Selûne is the moon itself, that her body is the silver disk watching. Others claim the moon is her creation, and she is something greater that wears it like a mask. Sages will argue about metaphysics. Sailors will tell you a simpler truth. When the moon is bright, travel is easier. When the moon is new, shadows grow teeth. In the age of myth, Selûne's light was the first gentle lamp in a universe that was still learning how to be solid. Her radiance did not merely illuminate, it stabilized. It gave rhythm, nights, tides, months, cycles, and cycles are the skeleton of history. Shah's answer, the seduction of shadow. Where Selûne illuminates, Shah conceals. Where Selûne encourages change, Shah offers release. Shah's portfolio is often spoken of as darkness, but that is a simplification. Darkness is merely the cloak. The body beneath it is loss, secrets, forgetfulness, and the dangerous comfort of surrender. In later ages, Shah's priests would whisper that the world is a mistake, that existence is pain, and that the truest mercy is oblivion. These are not new ideas. They are the same argument Shah made at the beginning, that a quiet universe is better than a living one. When Mistral formed the weave, Shah saw another form of insult. Not only was the world alive, it now had rules that made it easier for that life to persist and meddle. So Shah began to seek loopholes. Even in the oldest liturgies, you find hints that Shah and Selûne did not simply fight with light and dark. They fought with architecture. They argued over the shape of reality itself. Selûne made paths. Shah made traps. Selûne made doors. Shah made locks. It is fashionable to call Shah patient. I call her long-minded. She does not forget. She waits for the moment when a net frays, planes before maps. Now you may be wondering, where were the planes in all this? The Feywild, the Shadowfell, the Outer Planes, the places where gods dwell and fiends bargain. The honest answer is the planes were and were not. The planes are not separate places in the way Waterdeep is separate from Neverwinter. They are states of reality, layers of meaning, reflections, and roots. In some ancient cosmologies, the planes are described as a great wheel, circling endlessly, each plane a spoke where souls travel. In others, they are described as a world tree, branches and roots, with realms nested like leaves. In still others, scholars speak of an astral sea above and an elemental chaos below, with the material plane balanced between. All of these maps are attempts to draw infinity with mortal ink. And the oldest myths suggest that in the age of myth, the map was still being drawn. When Selûne and Shah shaped realm space, they did not merely form planets. They carved out conceptual space, places for dreams, for shadows, for the dead, for the divine. Those places would later be understood as planes, domains, and echoes. But an early cosmos is fluid. Boundaries shift, names change, even the gods negotiate. If you ever wonder why planar scholars sound like they are describing different realities, remember this. They are describing different centuries. The planes have been interpreted and perhaps rearranged more than once. Mistral and the gentle age of magic. Most mortals who think of Mystra think of strict laws. Magic must be controlled. The art must have limits. No spell above the 9th. That is Mystra after catastrophe. That is Mystra after watching arcanists try to steal divinity. Mistral, by contrast, is remembered as gentle. In the oldest accounts, Mistral did not hoard magic. She wandered it. She delighted in the strange ways creatures learned to shape it. She was less a judge and more a river guiding its own flow. There are fables, perhaps only fables, of Mistral appearing as a laughing child made of blue-white flame, teaching a curious spirit how to turn a stone into a song. There are older tales of her taking the form of a star-bright stag, leading early fae through the thinnest places between worlds. Do I believe every one of these tales? No, but I believe the pattern they reflect. In the age of myth, magic was not yet politicized. The weave existed, the gods existed, but mortal empires had not yet built their towers and declared, "This power is mine." It was, briefly, an age of possibility. And possibility is what made the next catastrophe inevitable. Because possibility attracts hunger, and hunger attracts war. We have spoken of the two sisters, of Chauntea's desire for life, and of Mistral's first weaving. Now we must speak of the other great powers that stirred in the earliest ages, powers that did not care for moonlight or gardens, powers that considered the world a lump of clay to be smashed and remade. We must speak of the primordials. But first, let me pull another volume from the shelf. Listen to the sound of the spine cracking. That sound, apprentice, is older than most nations. The first concepts. A living world does not merely grow plants, it grows ideas. Once Chauntea's dream of life began to take root, once warmth coaxed water into motion and soil into softness, new needs arose. Creatures would hunger, creatures would mate, creatures would fear, creatures would die. And when something happens often enough, it becomes a concept. And when a concept becomes strong enough, something in the multiverse notices. Sometimes that something is a god. Sometimes it is a primordial. Sometimes, rarely, it is something older and stranger that does not like to be named. Time, memory, and the shape of change. You may ask, who governs time? That question alone has launched 3 wars and at least 5 academic feuds in Candlekeep. In Elven tradition, time is often associated with Labelas Enoreth, one of the Seldarine, who is called the Lord of Continuance. But the Seldarine themselves are not the oldest powers in realm space, at least not in the ways Selûne and Shar are oldest. So Labelas, in that telling, is a steward of time as elves understand it. Long, patient, cyclical. Humans, in contrast, have worshipped many powers as masters of time, fate, or destiny. Some place it under Savris's eye, some under Ogma's quill, some under the cold accounting of Jurgle, some under the spinning coin of Timora. In the age of myth, it may be simplest to think of time not as a single god possession, but as a property of reality that gods and primordials both tried to bend. Change itself, Selûne's true nature, implies time, and Shah's longing for stillness implies the wish to freeze it. So perhaps time was one of the first battlegrounds. Perhaps the age of myth is not merely old, but old in a way that resists measurement, because the measure itself was being fought over. When death learned a name. The first time a living thing died on a Bea Toril, there was no precedent, there was no ritual, there was no grave. The world was young enough that even the gods had to decide what death would mean. Some creation myths suggest that Shah wanted death to be final, an absolute return to nothingness, an ending so complete that even memory would not survive. In such a universe, loss is not merely inevitable, it is the destination. Selûne and Chauntea resisted, not because they were sentimental, do not mistake them for mortal poets, but because a world where death is utterly final is a world where growth becomes meaningless. Why plant if the harvest is oblivion? Why struggle if the reward is erasure? Thus, in many tellings, the idea of an afterlife begins here, not as comfort for mortals, but as a compromise in the cosmic argument. And as soon as there is an afterlife, there is a keeper of it. In Faerûnian lore, the oldest deity associated with death is often named Jurgal. Jurgal is not popular. That is not his purpose. He is described as an ancient, skeletal scribe, an unblinking accountant of endings who once held dominion over death, the dead, and the fate of souls. In later ages, he would surrender much of that dominion to upstart gods of ambition and murder. But in the age of myth, if Jurgal existed, he would have been something close to an axis, the fixed point around which the restless wheel of life could turn without flying apart. Do not imagine Jurgal as cruel. Cruelty is passion, and Jurgal is older than passion. He is inevitability made meticulous. There are whispered stories, again possibly only stories, of Jurgal meeting Mistral in the earliest ages and striking a quiet agreement. The weave would allow life to twist reality, but death would remain the one spell that cannot be countered forever. Resurrection, even in our modern age, is a defiance that comes with cost. If you have ever wondered why raising the dead is difficult, why it requires diamonds, why it demands faith, why it sometimes fails even when performed correctly, consider that perhaps the rule was set very early, and perhaps Jurgal wrote it down. Where do souls go? In modern Faerûn, a common answer is to the fugue plane to await judgment, then onward to the realm of their god. Those without faith may suffer grim fates. Those with treachery may find themselves claimed by darker powers. But even that common answer is not universal. Different eras have described the path of souls differently because the gods have rearranged the rules more than once. When the tablets of fate were stolen, for example, divine order frayed. When the spell plague tore at the weave, even the borders between life and death became uncertain in places. So what of the age of myth? I will offer you a picture that is more useful than certainty. Imagine that in the earliest cosmos, the afterlife was not a complex bureaucracy. It was a flow. Souls drifted like sparks from a fire. The strongest powers, gods with clear portfolios, primordials with hungry will, pulled those sparks toward them. Over time, as worship became currency and belief became architecture, that flow hardened into roads, gates, courts, and realms. In other words, the afterlife became civilized. And like all civilized things, it became political. Light, dawn, and the first sun. Now, let us speak of the sun. You have heard, no doubt, the names of solar deities: Amonator, the keeper of the eternal sun; Lathander, the morning lord. Perhaps even older or stranger names from foreign pantheons. You may have noticed something puzzling. Different regions of Faerûn tell different stories about who owns the sun. That is because the sun is too important to leave unclaimed. Some traditions insist Selûne created the sun as part of her gift of warmth. In these tales, the sun is not a separate deity at all, but a great flame heart hung in the heavens, either torn from the elemental fire or ignited from Selûne's own light. Other traditions say that Amonator rose as a god of law and order when the sun began to keep a regular course. In this telling, the sun's steady march across the sky is not simply astronomy, it is divine discipline. Still others say that Lathander emerged as the personification of dawn, renewal, beginnings, the moment when darkness breaks, whether or not he created the sun itself. Dawn is a concept distinct from the sun. A torch can create dawn in a cave. And then there are tales that Amonator and Lathander are not separate at all, but different faces of a single divine truth. An argument that has, at various times, been heresy, orthodoxy, and political strategy. In the age of myth, I suspect the truth is closer to this. Selûne and Shar defined light and darkness. The sun became the most obvious symbol of light. As the cosmos stabilized and mortals later sought patrons, different deities laid claim to stewardship of that symbol. The sun did not change. The stories around it did. Storm and sea. When nature became a throne. Once the world held water, it gained tides. Once it gained tides, it gained storms. Once it gained storms, sailors gained reasons to swear. Deities of fury, Talos, Umberli, Auril, Malar, are often called the gods of fury, a family of divine powers that embody the savage aspects of nature. Whether they were present in the age of myth or rose later as nature became more complex is debated. Yet consider, a young world is violent, a young sea is not gentle, a young climate is not predictable. It would not surprise me if the earliest storms and tempests were not governed by tidy gods at all, but by elemental powers, primordials, archomentals, and spirits of raw weather, until the divine pantheon grew thick enough to name them and bind them with worship. In other words, the ocean was once the territory of the primordials. And like all territories, it was contested. Beauty, love, and the dangerous, gentle gods. Do not assume that the age of myth was all war and thunder. Even in the earliest songs, there are hints of gentler portfolios stirring into being. Love, art, beauty, joy, the desire to adorn a life that might otherwise be brutish and short. Suna's faith teaches that beauty is not vanity, but a defiance of despair. If so, then Suna's power, whether she existed in the age of myth or rose later, would be a direct rebuttal to Shar's seduction. Where Shar says, "Let go," Sun says, "Cherish." Ogma's faith teaches that knowledge is sacred. If so, then Ogma's existence, again, whether early or later, turns my own vow into a kind of prayer. Memory becomes resistance. History becomes a weapon against oblivion. Timora and Bishaba, luck and misfortune, are often described as sisters, their relationship echoing Shah and Selûne in miniature. In a young world where survival depends on chance as much as skill, the concept of luck becomes a god's throne quickly. These portfolios may not have been born in a single moment. They may have coalesced over ages, but the age of myth is where the seeds were planted. The first time a creature chose to sing instead of hunt. The first time one creature spared another for reasons that had nothing to do with advantage. Such moments are small. They are also holy. The coming of fiends. Now, we must speak of an uglier birth. Because as soon as the cosmos had structure, it had places where structure failed. As soon as life had meaning, it had places where meaning was inverted. That inversion is what mortals call evil. In many cosmologies of the multiverse, including those taught in certain realms' temples and in planar treatises kept under lock in my own vaults, the abyss began as a wound, a literal wound. There is a tale told among some planar scholars and preserved in fragments that an ancient deity, Tharizdun, the chained god, found or forged a seed of pure corruption and planted it in the raw elemental depths. That seed burrowed, it ate rules, it consumed boundaries, and from it grew the abyss, a plane of infinite layers where chaos metastasized into hunger. Whether you believe this tale or not, one fact remains: the abyss exists. Demons exist. And where demons exist, they seek to unmake. Against them stand devils, lawful fiends of the 9 hells, who seek not to unmake, but to bind. Their wars are older than mortal nations, and their conflict is called the Blood War. Some say it is the multiverse's fever, keeping demons and devils occupied so they do not devour everything else. Others say it is simply what happens when 2 forms of evil compete for the same prey. What does this have to do with Faerûn? Everything. Because cults in the realms have always found ways to poke holes in the fabric of reality. Demon cults, devil cults, elemental cults, star-spawn cults that worship things that should not be worshipped. The age of myth is where many of these forces took their first shapes. And the Dawn War, yes, we are approaching it, was not merely a local scuffle on one world. It was part of a larger upheaval across planes, when the cosmos decided whether it would be buildable or breakable. If you feel the temperature in this chamber drop, apprentice, do not look at the candles. They are fine. It is the subject matter that chills. Because now we must speak of the powers that looked at Abeir Toril and saw not a garden, not a sanctuary, not a home, but a prize. The primordials, the older hunger. If the gods are ideas given will, then primordials are matter given temper. That is the simplest distinction. A god is worship, shaped into personhood. A god's power grows as belief grows. A god cares, sometimes selfishly, sometimes nobly, about stories, choices, prayers, vows. A primordial is not nourished by prayer. A primordial is nourished by existence. Storm does not need worship to be storm. Fire does not need temples to burn. Stone does not need hymns to endure. A primordial is the storm that learned to think, the fire that learned to hate, the sea that learned to remember. In the oldest tales, primordials rise from the elemental chaos, the boiling foundation beneath reality, where the elements churn without shape. Some scholars describe that chaos as the raw workshop of creation, a place where worlds are built and destroyed in an endless cycle. In such a worldview, the gods desire to finish a world, to stabilize it, seed it with life, let it persist, is an interruption. The primordials do not always share a single goal. They are as varied as the elements. Yet a common theme in myths of the Age of Myth is this. The primordials wanted Aber-Toril as clay. The gods wanted Aber-Toril as a home, and neither side was willing to yield. Elemental lords and sleeping titans. Some sages insist that not all primordials fought the gods. They speak of elemental lords, great powers of air, earth, fire, and water, who remained aloof, content to rule their respective inner realms rather than wage war for the surface of one world. You have heard their names, no doubt, spoken by druids and genasi and planar travelers, Akkadi of air, Grumbar of earth, Istishia of water, Kossuth of fire. Whether you call them gods, primordials, or something between depends on which temple you enter. And then there are the sleeping ones. Across Faerûn, in hidden caverns and beneath ancient ruins, there are places where the stone is wrong, too smooth, too warm, too alive. Places where magic pools in a way that tastes like iron and thunder. Places that feel less like geology and more like a heartbeat. These, some say, are the prisons or the dreams of primordials that were bound during the Dawn War. In later ages, mortals would stumble upon them and make dreadful choices. A mining expedition cracks a seal. A cult digs too deep. A wizard seeks a power source. The Age of Myth is still present, apprentice. It sleeps and it dreams under your feet. The Blue Age. When the world was mostly water. Among those who divide prehistory into poetic eras, there is a term you may hear, the Blue Age. It is not a date, it is a mood. The Blue Age is described as a time when Aber-Toril was young enough that oceans dominated, continents were half-formed, and the sky itself was a deeper, stranger shade, blue not from gentle air, but from the raw saturation of a world still steeped in elemental influence. In some accounts, the Blue Age is the earliest phase of the Dawn War, the gods and primordials skirmishing across a world that had not yet settled into familiar geography. Seas boiled, storms never ended. Islands rose and sank like breathing lungs. In other accounts, the Blue Age was before the war, an uneasy peace in which primordials shaped the world's surface and the gods watched, waiting for the moment life could take hold. And in the most unsettling versions, the Blue Age is remembered by beings that claim they were there when the gods were young. Beings such as the aboleths. The aboleths, memory older than mercy. If you have never met an aboleth, count yourself fortunate. If you have met one and survived, count yourself marked. Aboleths are ancient aberrations that dwell in deep water and deeper arrogance. They are slime-slick, tentacled, and possessed of minds that do not think like ours. They do not merely remember, they inherit memory. Every aboleth is born with the experiences of its ancestors, a lineage of recollection stretching back through uncounted ages. And aboleths claim that their memory reaches back to the beginning. They claim they were here before the gods. They claim the world was theirs before Faerûn hung her lamp in the sky, before Chontea dreamed of gardens, before Mistral wove rules into magic. Do I believe them? I believe that they believe it, which is not the same thing. Yet their claims are not without weight. Aboleths possess knowledge that has no business surviving. They speak of when the seas were the only roads and when the sky tasted like metal. They hate the gods with a hatred that feels personal, as if the gods did not merely oppose them, but replaced them. Many sages interpret this hatred as evidence that aboleths once ruled vast undersea empires in the world's youth, empires of enslavement, manipulation, and psionic dominance. An aboleth does not conquer with an army. It conquers with certainty. It makes you doubt your own will until you begin to call your chains purpose. If aboleths did rule in the Blue Age, then the rise of the gods and the spread of mortal life would have been a direct threat to their dominion. Worship builds divine power. Faith creates saints and heroes. Aboleths prefer subjects who do not pray. This is why aboleths are so often associated in later ages with ancient conspiracies and submerged cities that drift like nightmares. Some even whisper the name of a floating aboleth city that has appeared and vanished across ages, a remnant of a primordial time. Names are dangerous. I will not speak that one too loudly tonight. Suffice it to say, when you look at Faerûn and think the deepest mysteries lie in deserts and ruins, remember the sea. Water keeps secrets well. The Dawn War, when the world became a battlefield. Now we reach the heart of the age of myth. The Dawn War. If you ask a priest of Selûne, the Dawn War began when the primordials, coveting the newborn worlds of realm space, invaded to claim them. Selûne and Shar, rivals though they were, both moved to defend their creation, for even Shar prefers a universe that is hers to extinguish, not one stolen from her. If you ask a primordial cultist, "Gods preserve us from their sermons," they will tell you the opposite, that the primordials were the true creators of the material worlds, and that the gods were parasites who arrived later, meddling with the natural cycle of creation and destruction. In their view, the Dawn War was a righteous attempt to reclaim the workshop. If you ask a plainer scholar, they may tell you that the Dawn War's true catalyst was the birth of the Abyss, an infection that drew attention, corrupted powers, and destabilized the balance between elemental chaos and divine order. And if you ask me, I will tell you that the Dawn War is likely not one simple war at all, but a name mortals gave to overlapping cataclysms across ages. Wars of gods against primordials, gods against gods, gods against the consequences of their own choices. Still, certain patterns appear in the record strongly enough that even a skeptic must respect them. Pattern 1. The war was vast. Not confined to Toril, not confined to the material plane. Myths and planar treatises alike insist that the conflict spilled across planes, into the astral reaches, into shadowed reflections, into elemental depths, and even into other worlds that share the multiverse with us. Pattern 2. The war was formative. Mountains, seas, and skies were changed. The world's final shape, if such a thing exists, was carved in this struggle. Pattern 3. The war had consequences that echo into 5th edition Faerûn. Prisons, relics, divine grudges, elemental cults, strange places where reality feels thin. The first battles, gods outmatched. In many tellings, the primordials were stronger at first. They were older in the sense that element is older than idea. They fought like natural disasters with intention. They hurled continents, they boiled seas, they tore holes between plains. The gods had power, yes, but they were fewer, less organized, and more dependent on the fragile beginnings of mortal worship. Their servants, angels, celestials, and whatever early mortals existed, were brave but breakable. So the gods learned quickly that to survive, they needed strategy. Some legends credit Bane, yes, Bane, the Black Hand, the god of tyranny, as one of the first to impose order upon divine warfare. In these tales, Bane convinced rival gods to fight in coordinated groups, to set aside squabbles long enough to kill or bind specific primordials one by one. The idea that a tyrant god helped save the cosmos is uncomfortable. Reality often is. The dragons enter the war, and then there are the dragons. In many draconic myths, the first dragon god is called Io, or Asgarath, or by other names that change like scales in light. He is described as the ninefold dragon, the progenitor of dragonkind, a power so old that his blood tastes like creation. According to one dramatic legend, Io led an army of dragons against the primordials. Dragons in that era were not mere beasts of hoarding and lairs. They were cosmic weapons, living storms of fire, frost, lightning, and acid, with minds sharp enough to understand the stakes of the war. In this legend, Io slew primordials, titanic beings of element, until arrogance led him into a duel against a terrifying foe, a primordial king of terror wielding an adamantine axe. The tale claims Io was cleaved in two. From those two halves, the story continues, were born Bahamut and Tiamat, platinum and chromatic, protection and domination, two great dragon deities who would shape draconic fate forever after. Another version insists Bahamut and Tiamat existed already, and merely claimed Io's power when he fell. A third version, favored by some dragonborn traditions, says that in that battle, the first dragonborn rose from Io's spilled blood, born in war, shaped by divine loss, destined to walk between dragons and mortals. Do not worry, apprentice, if you cannot decide which legend is true. The important point is that dragonkind ties itself to the age of myth, and the realms behave as if that tie matters. Dragons remember, dragons hoard, dragons hate, dragons worship. Their oldest gods are not distant abstractions. They are wounds. The shadow epoch, when the sun failed. You may have noticed that many myths speak of a time when the world's light faltered. This is sometimes called the shadow epoch. In certain traditions, the Blue Age gave way to this darker phase, when the sun of realm space was diminished, devoured, or otherwise removed from its rightful place. One particularly grim myth claims that a colossal serpent, Dendar the night serpent, swallowed the sun, plunging the world into a prolonged twilight during the war. Other versions speak of the sun being wounded by primordial assault, its light weakened until the gods restored it. Still others treat this as symbolic, not a literal devouring, but an era when ash and storm darkened the skies so completely that it might as well have been night. Whatever the literal truth, the Shadow Epoch is remembered as the most desperate phase of the Dawn War. It is the stage in which the gods nearly lost. And it is the stage in which betrayals and unlikely alliances appear in the myths. Ubtao, the Deceiver. In some accounts, a primordial, or a being primal enough to be called one, turned against his kin during the war and aided the gods. That being is sometimes named Ubtao. Yes, Ubtao. The same god associated in later ages with Chult, maze-maker, watchful guardian, the power who abandoned his people and left them to their own choices. How could a Chultan god be a primordial traitor in the age of myth? Because Chult's stories are old, apprentice, older than most northerners give them credit for. If Ubtao was once a primordial, an ancient power of the world's raw shape, then his later role as a god of a specific land makes a strange kind of sense. A being that can shape continents can also shape a maze. A being that can deceive its own kin can also test mortals with twisting paths. Again, I do not present this as certain. I present it as one of those fascinating threads where cosmology and local faith knot together, the binding of the primordials. How did the Dawn War end? The simplest answer is with prisons. The primordials were not all slain. Some were too vast to kill, some were too fundamental. Killing them would have been like killing fire or stone. So the gods bound them. They sealed them in the world. They chained them in elemental depths. They trapped them beneath mountains, in glaciers, in caverns, in places where the weave could reinforce the lock. In later ages, mortals would stumble upon these bindings and call them dungeons. In truth, they are scars. A pause, apprentice. Let your mind breathe. Because we are about to reach the most controversial piece of the age of myth, one that touches directly upon the history you heard in our first episode. The changing of stars. The changing of stars, the twin worlds. There is a phrase that appears in several ancient sources, some elven, some draconic, some planar, that translates imperfectly as the changing of stars. It is not a poetic reference to astronomy. It is a reference to reality rearranging itself. In many accounts, the end of the Dawn War did not simply leave scars. It changed the fundamental relationship between gods, primordials, and the world they fought over. And this is where the story becomes contentious. Ao's great decision. Some traditions claim that Ao, observing the devastation wrought by gods and primordials alike, enacted a separation to prevent such a war from tearing the world to nothing. In this telling, Aber Toril was sundered into twin worlds. Toril, where the gods' influence would be strongest, where the weave would be tended, and where mortal worship would shape divine power. Aber, a harsher twin, where the gods withdrew or were barred, leaving primordials, dragons, and other primal powers to contend without divine oversight. The image offered by many sages is simple: a cracked shell, two halves drifting side by side, sometimes brushing against one another. This is not merely myth. In modern history, we have seen lands exchange places between Toril and Abir during cosmic upheavals. The spell plague and its aftermath tore holes between the twins, and pieces were swapped like stolen coins. The second sundering sealed many of those wounds, but not all. So the twin worlds are real enough. The question is chronology. Was the splitting of Aber and Toril truly an event at the end of the Dawn War, an act of Au in the Age of Myth? Or is this a later attempt by sages to connect multiple catastrophes into a single tidy narrative? Some sources, particularly those rooted in mortal history rather than cosmic myth, tie the world's great split to a much later cataclysm. The Tearfall, when a chunk of celestial stone struck the world near the end of the Creator Race era, bringing ruin and climate shift. If that is true, then the changing of stars may have been metaphorical or partial or a different event entirely. My own view is this: there may have been more than one sundering. Reality, apprentice, is not obliged to crack only once. Au may have acted at the end of the Dawn War to set boundaries, and later catastrophes, Tearfall, spell plague, sundering, may have reopened wounds, echoed ancient patterns, or created new fractures that mortals later described with the same language. When a culture survives an apocalypse, it reaches for the oldest words it knows. Split, sundering, falling star, and so the myths stack. Let us speak then of what the twin worlds represent, because even if the precise date is debated, the difference between them has shaped Faerûn's history profoundly. Aber, the harsh twin. Aber is often described as a world where the god's presence is thin. Not absent in an absolute sense, belief is a stubborn thing, but diminished, muted, constrained. In many accounts, Aber belongs to the primordials, or rather, it belongs to those primal powers that are not dependent on mortal worship. In such a world, the creatures that thrive are those who can survive without divine aid. Elementals, titans, great beasts, and, most famously, dragons. If Toril is the stage where gods and mortals negotiate, Aber is the arena where tooth and claw decide. War of fang and talon. Among the oldest tales associated with Aber is a conflict sometimes called the War of Fang and Talon, a war in which dragons rebelled against primordial tyranny. Picture it, a world where titanic elemental beings treat dragons as tools, as weapons, as ornamental monsters to be pointed at rival primordials. A world where draconic pride is used and discarded. Dragons do not accept that role for long. So the legends say the dragons rose. They turned their flame and storm against their former masters. They carved dominion with brutality that would make even modern worms blush. The war is remembered in fragments. Mountains ripped apart, seas turned to steam, skylands falling like broken teeth. Some traditions insist that many primordials were slain or driven into hiding during this rebellion, forced to retreat into the deepest elemental pockets of Aber. Others claim the primordials were never truly defeated, only bargained with, only pushed back, only lulled into slumber. Again, prisons are a recurring theme in cosmic history. Dragonborn and the legacy of chains. If you have walked the modern streets of Faerûn, you have seen Dragonborn. Proud, scaled folk with clan names and a sense of honor that can be as rigid as dwarven law. Many Dragonborn traditions claim their people originated on Abeir, born in an age of draconic rule, shaped by the needs of war, forged in the shadow of dragons. Some tales present Dragonborn as the descendants of draconic servants, created as soldiers or slaves in the titanic conflicts of the primordials. Others claim Dragonborn are the children of dragons and mortals, a bridge species born from desperation. Whatever the truth, Dragonborn memory carries a theme that fits Abeir too well. They remember tyranny. They remember being used. And they remember the hard, proud decision to become something more than a tool. You may wonder why I dwell on Abeir when our focus is Faerûn on Toril. Because Abeir is not gone. It is a twin, it is near, and in the modern age it has intruded, sometimes violently, into our history. The spell plague brought pieces of Abeir to Toril, and with them came Dragonborn nations, displaced lands, and the lingering taste of a world where gods do not hold the leash. To understand that intrusion, you must understand the twin. Toril, the world of gods and roads. Toril, in contrast, is the world where gods established their strongest foothold. The world where worship became a force as real as gravity. The world where the weave, Mistril's great spell, was tended and later guarded with increasing strictness. If Abeir is raw survival, Toril is story. Do not mistake that for softness. Stories can be cruel, but Toril is the world where a mortal's choice can echo into divinity, where a village's prayers can draw a blessing, where a king can claim legitimacy from a temple and be undone when the temple withdraws it. In some accounts, when the Dawn War ended and the primordials were bound or banished, the sun was restored and the oceans thawed. That phrase, the oceans thawed, appears in certain ancient summaries as the transition point between the age of myth and the next era of mortal prehistory. It is perhaps the first time the world feels like it belongs to creatures who are not cosmic. And that is where the creator races will soon enter our tale. But not yet, because there is one more thread we must address before we close this lesson. What happened to the primordials on Toril? Primordials beneath the skin of the world. If the gods gained Toril, they did not cleanse it. They could not. As I said earlier, some primordials are too fundamental to kill, and even those that can be slain leave residue, elemental scars that become volcanoes, hurricanes, rifts, and strange places where physics seems optional. So the gods bound many primordials into Toril itself. Imagine a titan chained beneath a mountain, its anger leaking upward as earthquakes. Imagine a living flame sealed under a dwarven city, its heat powering forges and tempting fools who think they can control it. Imagine an ocean trench that is not merely deep, but hungry, because something in it still dreams of the Blue Age. You have heard stories in the modern realms of primordial embers, of ancient elemental evils, of cults that call themselves prophets of a sleeping power. Those stories are not new. They are the echo of a cosmic compromise. The gods could not erase the primordials. So they buried them. A few words on the primal spirits. Some planar traditions speak of another set of powers that rose during or after the Dawn War. Primal spirits, nature entities that are neither gods nor primordials, but the living will of the world itself. In some tellings, these spirits enacted a primal ban, sealing the material plane from outsiders unless summoned, to prevent gods and primordials from rampaging freely across mortal lands again. Whether this ban is literal law or mythic metaphor, it matches a pattern we see in later ages. It is difficult for gods to simply walk the world at will. When they do, such as during the time of troubles, reality shudders. It is as if the world resists. Perhaps that resistance was learned in the age of myth. Perhaps the world grew a kind of immune system. If so, then you and every other mortal in Faerûn live inside a compromise forged by ancient war, a world protected in part by the scars of that protection. This is the bitter wisdom of history, apprentice. Sometimes the only shield available is the wound that never healed. We have spoken of creation, of the weave, of the birth of gods and fiends, of primordials and the Dawn War, and of the great rearrangement that left us with twin worlds. Now, before we close our second lesson, we must ask the question that every practical adventurer eventually asks, no matter how poetic the lore. Why does this matter to me? The answer is not philosophical. The answer is that the age of myth is still present. And in the next section, before we extinguish the lamps for the night, I will show you exactly how the age of myth reaches into your tavern tales, your dungeon maps, and your 5th edition campaigns. Because history is never dead. It is merely buried. Why the age of myth still matters. You may be thinking, apprentice, Aurelian, this is beautiful, this is terrifying, this is far too large, but I am not a god. I am not a primordial. I am a person with a sword, a spellbook, or a stubborn desire to survive. Why should I care what Shar and Saloon argued about before there were even trees? A fair question, a mortal question. And here is my answer. Because you live on a battlefield that has been merely quieted. The age of myth is not behind you in the way yesterday is behind you. It is beneath you. It is inside the rules of the world. It is in the structures that keep reality from tearing like wet paper. When those structures fray, when the weave is wounded, when a prison cracks, when twin worlds brush close, you feel it in your lifetime. You have already heard the proof. The time of troubles, 1358 DR, when gods walked the streets. The spell plague, 1385 DR, when magic became blue fire and geography became a suggestion. The Second Sundering, 1482 to 1487 DR, when the world tried to set itself back into its older grooves. These were not random events. They were echoes of the age of myth. The weave is a choice, not a law of nature. Remember Mistral's first weaving. The weave is not gravity, it is not sunlight, it is not an inevitable property of matter. It is a decision made by a goddess to let magic exist in a form that minds can touch. When Mistral died to stop Casus's folly, she did so because she valued that decision more than her own continuity. She chose the world over herself. In later ages, Mistra would become stricter because mortals proved repeatedly that given a net, they will try to climb it like a ladder to heaven and then complain when it snaps. Yet even strict Mistra cannot make magic unbreakable, because it was never unbreakable in the first place. It is a great spell, and great spells can be disrupted. Every spellcaster in Faerûn owes their craft to a mythic compromise, raw magic made usable at the price of dependence on a divine structure. That is why anti-magic is so terrifying. It is not merely a trick, it is an attack on the oldest architecture of the world. Shah's long revenge. Shah's hatred for the weave is not petty, it is ideological. The weave is the scaffolding of persistence. It allows memory to become power. It allows hope to become spell. And Shah, who longs for oblivion, cannot tolerate a universe that makes persistence easier. This is why Shah has, in different eras, sought to undermine magic itself, whether by creating alternative structures like the shadow weave, by corrupting magic, or by striking at Mistra in moments of weakness. The spell plague, in many accounts, was not merely a magical accident. It was a weapon in a cosmic argument that began with Selûne bringing warmth into the void. Do you see the thread? A quarrel at creation becomes an apocalypse 15,000 years later. That is how long the gods hold grudges, the primordials in the basement. Now, let us speak of primordials again. You may never meet a primordial in the street. If you do, the street will not survive the meeting, but you may meet their influence. Have you heard of places where the earth breathes heat in winter? Places where a spring runs hot and tastes of metal? Places where the wind moans with a voice that seems almost like language? Sometimes that is simply geology. Sometimes it is something older, leaking. In the north, beneath the ruins and halls of Gauntlgrim, lies a legendary source of fire, Megaera, called by some a Dawn Titan. Whether you label Megaera a primordial, a titan, or an elemental lordling is less important than this. It is a living furnace, a being of flame immense enough that dwarves have spent centuries trying to control it. When the dwarves harnessed that fire, they built wonders. When they lost control, the city suffered catastrophe. That is the age of myth in miniature. Titanic power chained, used, and always threatening to break loose. Across Faerûn, you will find similar examples if you know how to look. A crater that still crackles with strange energy. A mountain whose storms never cease. A ruin whose stones are too smooth, as if melted by a fire that had teeth. Sometimes adventurers call these elemental nodes. Sometimes cultists call them sacred sites. Sometimes dwarves call them a bad place to mine. In truth, They are wounds from an ancient war, points where the world's skin is thin enough that old forces can bleed through. A bear's shadow in modern blood. And then there is a bear. When Dragonborn walk the streets of Faerûn, they are not merely another people. They are proof that our world has a twin with a different history, proof that reality can exchange parts like a careless merchant swapping labels on jars. The spell plague did not create a bear. It merely reopened the door between the twins and shoved it wide enough for nations to spill through. When you see Dragonborn honor codes, clan politics, old resentments, and the hard pride of a people forged under draconic tyranny, you are seeing the cultural shadow of the age of myth intruding into the current age. When you see Genasi, mortals with elemental blood, appearing in greater numbers after planar instability, you are seeing elemental influence rise as the boundaries between planes shift. When you see cults of elemental princes whispering the names of powers like Imix, Ogremok, Olhydra, and Yansi Bin, whether as true beings, titles, or masks, you are seeing the age of myth's elemental politics echoed in mortal fanaticism. You may not care about ancient cosmology until it knocks over your city wall. It has a habit of doing that. Myths become maps. Here is another practical reason the age of myth matters. It explains why the realms are full of impossible places. Why do certain forests feel like they are watching you? Because the Feywild is not another world. It is an echo, and some places resonate more strongly with that echo, especially places where saloons change and Chantea's growth once ran wild. Why do some ruins feel heavier than stone? Because the Shadowfell is not merely gloom. It is the weight of loss, and Shah's influence pools in places where despair has deep roots. Why do ancient sites often have rules that modern reality does not? Because mythals, wards, and bindings laid in elder ages, some even rooted in the weave's earliest architecture, still hum beneath newer stone. When an adventurer finds a ruin that does not obey physics, that adventurer has stumbled into history that never fully ended. The oldest question, who owns the world? At the heart of the age of myth lies a simple question. Does the world belong to those who shaped it, or those who live on it? The primordials shaped, the gods seeded, mortals inherited. And inheritance is always contested. Every major conflict in Faerûn's deep history echoes this question. The creator races shaped other beings as tools, echoing primordial arrogance. The Netherese tried to seize divinity, echoing the gods' hunger for control. The time of troubles punished gods for neglect, echoing Ao's insistence on order. The spell plague shattered magic, echoing Shah's yearning for oblivion. The second sundering restored boundaries, echoing the ancient desire to stabilize. If you are an adventurer, you will meet this question in smaller forms. Does a dragon own the mountain it lairs in? Does a kingdom own the forest it taxes? Does a cult own a ruin because their god is older than the stones? Does a people own a homeland that was swapped to another world by cosmic accident? The age of myth is the first time the question is asked at full volume. Everything after is a quieter argument in the same language. A bridge to the next lesson. Now, we must close our tome for tonight. Not because the age of myth is exhausted. Oh no. We could speak for 100 nights and still only touch its edges. But because history has a rhythm, and if you are to keep what you learn, you must not drown in it. So here is where we stand. The cosmos formed. Ao set boundaries, or watched boundaries form. Shar and Selûne shaped the earliest heavens of realm space and quarreled over what the world should be. Chauntea awakened as the spirit of Abir Turil and demanded warmth for life. Selûne brought that warmth, and Shar's opposition turned creation into conflict. From that conflict, Mistral was born, and she wove the weave, the first enduring spell that made magic stable enough for minds to touch. Concepts solidified. Death gained a keeper. The sun gained stories. Storm and sea gained thrones. Fiends rose in the cracks of reality's structure. Primordials, older hungers of element, contested the world, and the Dawn War carved scars into the cosmos. In the aftermath, primordials were bound, the world stabilized, and the twin worlds of Abir and Toril became distinct in myth and in fact. This is the stage upon which the next age begins. Because once the gods and primordials stepped back, once the world was no longer a direct battlefield of cosmic powers, there was room for something else to rise. Mortal empires, or more accurately, the creator races. Next episode, we will step into the days of thunder in true detail, far deeper than the broad sweep we gave them in our first lesson. We will speak of the Saruk, the Batrachi, and the Ayari, not as names on a page, but as living cultures with cities, obsessions, and terrifying magic. We will speak of the Nether Scrolls, and why the very idea of life-shaping still haunts the realms. We will speak of the great cataclysm remembered as the Tearfall, and why some sages insist it is the echo of an older sundering. And yes, we will speak of what happens when mortals inherit divine and primordial mistakes. But before we end, I will leave you with a question, because questions are how lore becomes yours, not merely mine. If you could witness one moment of the age of myth safely, apprentice, do not be greedy. What would you choose? Would you watch Selûne cast her first tears into the void and see the heavens fill with light? Would you listen at the edge of the first weaving, hearing Mistral bind chaos into law? Would you stand in the storm of the Dawn War and watch gods and primordials clash like continents, knowing you are seeing the world's bones being set? Or would you choose something smaller? The first time a living thing died, and the universe decided that death would not be the end of story. Hold that thought. Write it down if you must. And if you're listening through a sending stone or a scrying mirror, if this lorecast reaches you through some marvel of modern artifice, then leave me a comment with your answer. Even better, tell me what you want next. Which era, which people, which god, which primordial, which city, which faction. Do you want the tangled family of the Seldarine and the fall of Araushne into Lolth? Do you want the cold accounting of Jurgle and the strange bargains of the dead? Do you want the dragon gods and the wars that taught worms to hate? Do you want Abeir's tyrants and the roots of dragon-born honor? Name your fascinations. I will file them carefully. I do not sleep, after all, and curiosity is a fine substitute for breathing. Now, let us close the lamp glass. Let the candles gutter lower. We are not finished. We are merely turning the page. Addendum to the Age of Myth, the peoples before peoples. Before we end, there is one more corridor in this library that you deserve to walk tonight. Because when I say the Age of Myth, I do not mean only gods and primordials wrestling in the sky. I mean the myths that the peoples of Faerûn carry in their bones, the stories that explain to an elf or a dwarf or an orc why the world feels the way it does. These myths are not always historically accurate in the way a modern scribe would demand. They are accurate in a deeper way. They reveal what a people believes about itself. And belief shapes destiny. So let us speak of the first peoples, not as they appeared in mortal history, but as they appear in divine memory. The first elves and the betrayal of Araushne. Elven lore does not begin on Toril. It begins in Arvandor, the realm of Faerûn Lorecast, the elven creator and patron of art, magic, and the fierce, beautiful sadness that elves sometimes mistake for wisdom. In elven myth, Corellon's blood is silver and starlight. From that blood, or from his dreams, or from the songs he sang into the raw stuff of the plains, the first elves were shaped, beings of grace and change, living echoes of the Feywild's wild beauty. They were meant to be free. And freedom, apprentice, always attracts jealousy. Among the Seldarine, the elven pantheon, there was a goddess named Araushne. She was once associated with destiny, with the weaving of fate, with the subtle thread that connects choices across time. Some tellings paint her as brilliant, ambitious, and bitterly resentful of Corellon's effortless radiance. Araushne plotted. She struck bargains with darker powers. Some myths say she reached toward the abyss. Others say she sought allies among gods who envied Corellon. Still others insist her allies were not gods at all, but hungry concepts, betrayal, spite, the desire to control the uncontrolled. In the great story, called by some the War of the Seldarine, Araushne attempted to overthrow Corellon and seize rulership over elven destiny. The attempt failed. Corellon cast her down, out of Arvandor, out of the Seldarine's grace, into darkness and exile. In the fall, Araushne transformed. Destiny twisted into obsession. Subtle weaving became sticky entrapment. The goddess who once guided fate became the Spider Queen. Lolth. That transformation is not merely a moral lesson. It is cosmology. It explains why the Drow's patron goddess is not simply a villain, but a fallen ideal turned predatory. Lolth's fall also helps explain why elven history is haunted by shame. When elves speak of betrayal, they do not mean only mortal politics, they mean their own divine origin story. And yes, before you ask, there are elven traditions that treat this tale differently. Some drow tellings insist Lolth was never Araushne, never a traitor, but always the rightful queen, denied by jealous gods. Some scholars argue that Arashni was a name elven priests invented to soften the horror of realizing their own pantheon produced a monster. I cannot resolve that argument for you tonight. I can only say this: Lolth is real. Her webs reach far, and the first strand was cast in the age of myth. Ilistrae and Faerûn, children of a fallen queen. Even in darkness, stories grow branches. In many traditions, Lolth has children. Two names matter most to the realms. Ilistrae, often called the Dark Maiden, a goddess who offers Drow a path of beauty and redemption, moonlight on a blade, song in a cavern. Faerûn, a god of thievery, masks, and male ambition among the Drow, an echo of elven pride warped into secrecy. Whether these two are literal offspring or mythic aspects does not change their importance. They represent choices within a people, to seek the surface and change, or to seek power in shadow. Those choices will matter when we reach the descent in later episodes. For now, remember, the Drow were not born only of surface war and curses. Their divine drama began long before a single elven city fell to flame. Moradin and the First Forge. Now let us step into a different myth hall. Dwarven creation stories are not delicate. They smell of smoke. Dwarves speak of Moradin, the soul forger, shaping the first dwarves from stone and metal. In some hymns, he hammered them on an anvil that rang so loudly it became the first thunder. In others, he breathed heat into cold rock and watched stubborn life glow into being. Unlike the elven myths of gardens and song, dwarven myths begin with labor. Not because dwarves lack beauty, but because to dwarves beauty is made. Moradin's creation is often presented as an act of defiance, a refusal to let the world remain soft and fragile. Dwarves were made to endure, to hold, to dig, to build halls that would outlast storms and kings alike. This is why dwarves feel such kinship with stone. They are not merely from the earth, they are of it. And in the age of myth, when primordials raged and mountains were still settling into place, such a people would have been a powerful statement. The world can be shaped by hands, not merely by cosmic tantrums. The Maundin Salmon, the dwarven pantheon, gathers around Moradin like a clan around a hearth. Beranar teaches loyalty, Dumatoin guards secrets, Clangadin calls for battle, Vergadain tempts with trade and luck. Each is a tool for survival. Dwarven myth says they were born already knowing their gods' names. I believe that, in a sense. A people forged in a divine story carries the story like muscle memory. Giants and the Ordning. If dwarves are the children of the forge, giants are the children of the storm. Giantkind speaks of Animal Father, a titan among gods, who set the Ordning, the divine hierarchy that orders giants by might, duty, and place. Storm giants at the top, then cloud, fire, frost, stone, hill, each with its own role, each with its own pride. In some tellings, giants were shaped as companions or rivals to dragons in the world's early ages. In others, giants are the earth's attempt to stand upright, mountains deciding to walk. The Ordning is, in mythic terms, an answer to chaos. After the Dawn War, after a world of unbound elemental rage, Giantkind's hierarchy is an attempt to impose order through strength. It is a philosophy as much as a social system. Power has a place. Place has a rule. Rule creates stability. This is why when giants later fall into disarray, when the ordning is shattered, as it is in some 5th edition tales, the world trembles. To giants, broken hierarchy is not politics. It is blasphemy. Dragons, greed, and the sacred wound. You have heard me speak of Io and the myth of his cleaving. What is important here is not the exact genealogy, but the psychological truth dragonkind carries. Dragons believe they were born from cosmic conflict. They remember the Dawn War as their inheritance. This is why dragons in Faerûn are not merely predators. They are theologians of self. A dragon hoards not only gold, but proof. Proof that it endures. Proof that it is worthy. Proof that the world's history is not passing it by. A worm's lair is a museum curated by ego. And when dragons speak of Bahamut and Tiamat, they are not merely reciting God's names. They are reciting the oldest split in their myth: protection and domination, honor and tyranny. Two answers to the question, what should power be for? In our modern age, dragon cults and draconic schemes often look like greed and cruelty. In the age of myth, greed itself may have been a survival strategy. To gather, to hold, to keep resources close in a world that could be remade by a primordial's tantrum. If you want to understand dragonkind apprentice, do not begin with their gold. Begin with their fear of being forgotten. The first orcs and the one-eyed grudge. Now, let us speak of a people whose myths are often dismissed by the so-called civilized. Orcs. Orcish tradition speaks of Grumsh One-Eye, the god of conquest, rage, and survival. The myth most commonly told in the north says that when the gods divided the world among their peoples, Grumsh was given nothing. He raged and he carved out territory by force, declaring that orcs would take what was denied them. In many versions, Corellin is Grumsh's great rival. They clash, light and fury, grace and brutality. In some tales, Corellin blinds Grumsh in one eye. In others, Grumsh sacrifices his own eye for power. Either way, the image remains, a god marked by loss, turning that loss into aggression. Do not mistake orcish myth for simple villainy. It is a narrative of grievance. Grievance is a powerful fuel. It can build nations. It can burn them. When you see orc raids in later history, you are seeing the mortal echo of a divine story. The belief that the world owes you and that taking is justice. That belief is dangerous. It is also understandable. In a cosmos where gods truly did divide power and place with the casual cruelty of beings who do not starve. Halflings, gnomes, and the myths of small courage. Not every creation myth is about war. Halfling tradition tells of Yondala, the protector, leading her people away from ancient dangers, guiding them into safety with cleverness rather than conquest. Halfling gods value home, luck, and quiet bravery. Their myths tend to be about survival through community rather than domination through strength. Gnomish tradition speaks of Garl Glittergold laughing even in danger, turning trickery into art. Gnomes treat creation itself as a prank played on boredom. In their stories, humor is not frivolous. It is armor. These smaller people's myths matter because they offer a counterpoint to the age of myth's grand violence. They insist that the cosmos is not only shaped by titans and gods, it is also shaped by the stubborn refusal of a small person to give up. Humans and the problem of many origins. And then there are humans. Humans are the most numerous people in Faerûn's current age, and yet they have the least unified creation myth. Why? Because humans have never been one people. Humanity in Faerûn is a patchwork of cultures, migrations, and imported pantheons. Some human groups claim descent from ancient tribes that arose on Toril. Others trace their divine lineages to gods who came from elsewhere, brought by planar gates, by abduction, by exile, by divine wandering. You have heard in our first lesson of the Mulan, humans brought from another world by Imaskari arrogance, whose gods forced their way into the realms to free them. That is not an age of myth story, but it is an example of the truth about humans. They arrive, adapt, and bring their gods with them. So in the age of myth, when we ask, where did humans come from? The most honest answer is, from many beginnings. And that multiplicity is itself a kind of myth. Humans as the people of change, the ones who do not have a single origin because their identity is movement. If Selûne is change as a goddess, humanity is change as a species, which is why humans are so good at building empires quickly, and why they are so good at destroying them. A final thread. The age of myth as a mirror. Now you see, apprentice, why I did not want to end tonight without walking this corridor. The age of myth is not only about what happened. It is about what the peoples of Faerûn believe happened. Elves believe betrayal is ancient and tragic, and so their history is full of long grudges and aching beauty. Dwarves believe endurance is sacred, and so their history is full of stubborn holds and deep oaths. Giants believe hierarchy is holy, and so their history trembles when the ordning is shaken. Dragons believe power must be proven, and so their history is full of hordes and ruthless memory. Orcs believe the world was denied them, and so their history is full of raids and raw grievance. Halflings believe safety is worth protecting, and so their history is full of quiet heroism. Gnomes believe laughter is survival, and so their history is full of cleverness. Humans believe change is inevitable, and so their history is full of feverish ambition. These are not stereotypes. They are mythic engines. And if you want to understand Faerûn, you must learn to hear those engines humming beneath the politics of any given year. One last skyward note, Selûne's tears and the archive above. I said we must end, and yet I find my hand drifting upward toward the shelves that hold star charts. Because the age of myth is not only beneath your feet, it is above your head. When mortals look at the sky, they often see romance or navigation or omens. A historian sees something else. A record. Not a clean record like ink on paper. A record written in impact craters, in orbital scars, in the quiet fact that the heavens still carry debris from the moment creation became conflict. Selûne's tears. You have heard me mention Selûne's tears, those wandering stones that circle Toril like a broken necklace. Astronomers chart them, spelljammers curse them, priests interpret them. In the oldest creation tales, Selûne shed them during her war with Shar. Some myths claim they are literal tears, fragments of divine essence hardened into stone as they drifted through the void. Others claim they are debris from early cosmic battles, shattered moons, broken worlds, the byproduct of gods and primordials hurling matter at one another like children throwing toys. Either way, the tears endure. And that endurance matters for two reasons. First, they remind us that divine acts leave physical residue. Myth is not always metaphor. Sometimes it is geology. Second, they are not harmless. From time to time, stones fall. A falling star is not merely a pretty streak across the night. It is a piece of ancient conflict returning to the world with the insistence of gravity, tearfall, and the habit of cataclysm. In later ages we will explore in detail when we speak of the creator races, there is a catastrophe remembered as the tearfall, the impact of a great celestial body that altered climate, geography, and the course of mortal history. Some sages insist that the tearfall was a fragment of Selûne's tears finally dropping out of its long orbit. Others argue that it was something else entirely, a moon shard, a weapon flung in a forgotten battle, a consequence of planar alignment, or a deliberate act by a primordial desperate enough to throw the heavens. Notice the pattern. Even when mortals do not know what struck the world, they reach back to the oldest myth they have. Selûne's sorrow, Shar's hatred, the sky itself breaking. The heavens, in other words, become a convenient language for disaster. But regardless of which theory you favor, the practical point remains. Stones from the sky have shaped Faerûn, and those stones are often strange. Metal that should not exist, crystal that hums with old magic, rock that resists scrying, dust that changes the behavior of spells. Such materials become the heart of artifacts, the foundation of towers, the temptation that drives wizards to arrogance. You cannot fully understand Netheryl's obsession with floating cities, for example, without remembering that in the age of myth, the sky was already a battleground. Mortals learned early to look upward and imagine power. Realm space and the not alone truth. There is another, quieter implication of the sky. Toril is not alone. This is a truth that priests sometimes dislike because it complicates the comforting idea that the gods built the world solely for us. It is a truth that wizards sometimes adore because it promises new secrets to steal. It is a truth that sailors understand instinctively because when you travel far enough, you learn the horizon is not the end of anything. In certain cosmologies, particularly those preserved among spelljamming lore, Toril exists within a vast sphere of wild space, with other worlds drifting in the same celestial ocean. Beyond that sphere lie other spheres, other suns, other worlds with their own histories and horrors. Even if you have never seen a spelljammer, even if you think such tales are tavern exaggerations, the realms themselves provide hints. Creatures like mind flayers, whose origins do not sit comfortably within any single terrestrial history. pantheons imported from elsewhere, carried by peoples who arrived through portals or abduction. Artifacts with designs that do not match any known mortal hand. The sky is not merely above us, it is connected, and that connection is part of the Age of Myth's legacy. When Selûne and Shar shaped the heavens, they were not shaping a closed box, they were shaping a neighborhood. So when later ages bring strangers, whether by gate, by spell-jamming hull, or by divine whim, you should not be surprised. The universe was never built as a solitary room. It was built as a hall with many doors. Stars as omens, stars as weapons. Now, a final thought, and then I will truly let you rest. When mortals look at falling stars, they make wishes. When gods look at falling stars, they remember battles. When primordials look at falling stars, they may see ammunition. This is not metaphor. In the oldest war songs, celestial bodies are thrown, moons are cracked, comets are guided, the sky is used as a sling. And if you ever wonder how a civilization could be so arrogant as to think it can control the heavens, remember that the gods and primordials already demonstrated it could be done. Mortals are, as ever, merely copying their elders. So yes, apprentice, write down your question about which moment of the Age of Myth you would witness, and perhaps add a second question. If a star fell in the night, would you see beauty? Or would you hear faintly the echo of an ancient war returning? Now we end. Marginalia, the tablets of fate and the price of divinity. One last set of pages, apprentice. These are not star charts. They are not hymns. They are rules. You have heard of the tablets of fate, yes? 2 slabs, so the stories say, upon which the duties and domains of the gods were inscribed. In the year of shadows, 1358 DR, those tablets were stolen, and Ao cast the gods down into mortal form as punishment. The time of troubles followed, and the realms bled for divine negligence. That part of the story belongs to recorded history. But the existence of the tablets points to something older. The moment when divinity stopped being only force and became office. Some traditions claim Ao wrote the tablets at creation, laying down the first law, that gods must hold portfolios, that portfolios have boundaries, that power has responsibility. In this telling, the tablets are not invented later. They are as old as the first sunrise, a constitution of the cosmos. Other traditions claim the tablets were created after the Dawn War, when it became clear that gods and primordials left unchecked would use worlds as cudgels. In this telling, the tablets are Ao's attempt to prevent a second age of myth, an attempt to ensure that gods do not fight with continents again, but with subtler tools: faith, prophecy, chosen champions, and the slow reshaping of mortal history. Notice how both theories agree on the same point. Someone, Ao or the universe itself, wanted limits, and those limits changed how the gods behaved. In the Age of Myth, the gods fought like generals. Later, they fought like patrons. They built churches, they sent visions, they granted spells, they elevated saints and condemned heretics. They made mortals into the chessboard. This is not merely because gods matured. It is because rules were imposed, and then in 1358 DR, those rules were broken, and the gods returned, briefly, to the old raw style of conflict, walking, bleeding, dying in the street. So if you want a single sentence that ties tonight's lesson to the modern realms, take this. The age of myth never ended. It was regulated, and regulation can fail. If that thought makes you uneasy, good. Unease is the beginning of wisdom. Now we truly end.